Okay, welcome back, and it's July 20th, 2016, and we're now going to spend a little time on the Roman legacy of Greek mythology. We have three chapters, 18, 19, and 20, which cover this subject. Today's video is going to cover a very quick overview of Roman history, and then we're going to spend a bit of time on Virgil's Aeneid tomorrow, and Ovid's Metamorphoses next Monday, July 25th. Now, I would first like you to pause your video. Please go over to Sakai, to the schedule, and please open the outline that is there for the unit for July 20th, 2016. It gives you some helpful information on the Roman history unit, including the three sections: Kings, Republic, and Empire. Please go pause your video and go and open that section of Sakai. Okay, are we all set? Excellent. All right, once again, as I've tried to do before, I'm going to be just relatively brief in the video about talking about these three sections of Roman history. Some of these areas will get some more detail in the next 2 days worth of lectures as we focus on Virgil and Ovid, but this will just give you a quick overview. Now, you may remember that our two earliest Greek authors, Homer and Hesiod, dated from somewhere around 800 to 700 BC. This, remember, is the beginning of the Archaic period in Greece, when the Greeks are emerging from the Dark Age period after the fall of the Mycenaean and Minoan worlds. And it also happens that that was around the time of the foundation of the Olympics, 776 BC as well, in Central Greece. So now we have Roman history where you'll notice that this date 753 BC shows up. 753 BC was a date that was settled upon by Roman scholars as the date for the actual construction of the city of Rome. I'm sorry to tell you that although it was outstanding that the Romans did that erudite type of calculation to come up with such a date, unfortunately, it has no real foundation in fact, because we have archaeological remains pretty well defined in the area of Rome, and we can tell easily that there are Roman remains that well predate 753 BC. We also know that some of the governmental structures used to run the city of Rome definitely must have come into Rome quite a bit later than 753 BC. So there doesn't really appear to be a real basis for fact for that particular date, unfortunately. The reason, however, why we need to rely on it is that we have a surviving history of Rome written by an author named Livy that is dated specifically from that particular date. There are other references to Roman events also that rely on that date as well. So even though we really don't have any good reason to use it, otherwise, for veracity's sake, we nonetheless do have to use it functionally because some aspects of our literature and history as we see it described to us rely on that opening date. So we just use it and we state that it's the canonical date of the founding of Rome. But it sounds very impressive to be able to say Rome started right now, but I'm sorry to say that that's not actually the case. All right. There's also a problem about this period of Roman history referred to as the King period. There are 7 kings of Rome, traditionally. Their reigns are described to us very thoroughly, very informatively by Livy, that same author. And as he describes it, we have 7 kings whose reigns run all the way from 753 to 509 BC. Possibly you might wonder how that possibly could have been, because that's about 250 years, and if you divide that out, you end up with an average of about 40 years for each, maybe a little less than that, like 30 to 40 years, let's say, for each king's reign. You might wonder, is that really possible? Are we supposed to believe that? No, unfortunately not, again. No, it's not believable. First of all, obviously we have a question about Romulus, because as far as I could tell, I do not think there are historical examples of kings who get grabbed in clouds of smoke and taken up to Mount Olympus. As far as I know, historically, I do not think that ever happens. First problem. Besides that, though, let's say, to be very generous, charitable, that maybe that was a little bit of mythic element infused into what otherwise is a true story. No, it simply does not make very much sense that 7 kings could have ruled peacefully for 250 years, 30 to 40 years each, especially the ones who were much more warlike. That didn't even happen with the emperors, and some of the emperors were really quite successful emperors, but no emperor got to reign that long. That simply did not happen. So as a result, we are aware that the 7-king history is just simply not at all in line with the truth. In fact, we even have alternate traditions that talk about other kings along the way, including even a king from outside who actually took over Rome for a time. That conveniently isn't described to us in living. So we're aware that this part of the history is really pretty unreliable as far as the truth of the occasion. And in general, that's actually true of a lot of the early Republican years as well as the kingship period. It's unfortunate because we obviously would have liked to have had a lot better, more reliable information here, but that, I'm afraid, is the way life worked out. We just unfortunately cannot go with that. All right, so the kings. Such as it is, we do have a history that describes for us 7 kings. The initial story that you're going to read in your textbook is Romulus and Remus, the 2 twins who were brought up by a she-wolf along the banks of the Tiber River. You might have noticed that the concept of a basket holding infants being thrown on the river might sound familiar. Oh yes, Moses. Okay. So what that tells us is there's very little about Roman mythology that is original to the Romans. Much of it is borrowed. By the way, shameless plug, come take my class, Classic 396. We talk all things Roman about Roman mythology. It's a fun class, come take it. Okay, so the Romans ended up borrowing a lot of scraps and bits and pieces from other myths as they constructed their own mythic history. And they were obviously aware as they were writing it that it probably was not truthful, but this was the best that they could do. And on balance, it's actually not that bad a history. It probably does have elements of it that are truthful. So okay, Romulus ends up the first king. Why not Romulus and Remus? Well, they have a little dispute. See, they're brothers. Now, initially, they had gotten along very well. The 2 brothers had worked together to get rid of their evil uncle, the scar of the family, right? His name was Amulius, because he had taken away the rule from their father, Numitor. You might actually also notice parallels with Jason, who was supposed to get his uncle Peleus out of power because his own father Aeson lost his power. So there's the story all over again. So the twins actually do get Numitor back in power. Later, they become in power themselves, and then they want to found a city. But they get into a dispute about where to put the border of the city, and also who will be first in charge. So each one goes running off trying to find vultures on a hill, because vultures are birds of good omen. So Romulus goes off to one hill, Remus goes off to another hill. Romulus comes back and says, well, I got to see 6 vultures. And Remus comes back and says, well, I got to see 12 vultures. Well, one says, I got to see my vultures first. The other brother says, well, but I got to see more of them. So they start fighting. And at one point in the fight, Remus runs over to the border where there's a sacred section called the Pomerium that is split off. He jumps over it as an insult. That's too much. Romulus grabs hold of Remus and kills him. Fratricide at the very beginning of Roman history. Would you believe it? You probably would. All you have to do is watch The Sopranos, right? Well, now, the Romans weren't happy about this element of their history. Horace the satirist, contemporary with Virgil in the 1st century BC, wrote a very famous epode number 16, in which he discusses the great honor that it is for the Romans to have been founded by these 2 brothers. Oh yes, a tradition based on fratricide. How very, very, very edifying. The Romans, even though they were very vainglorious about their power, were also very direct. and blunt about letting everybody know about the ills that went along with their republic and their empire. They were not by any means naive about the imperfections of their society. In any event, Romulus does rule as the first king. He actually institutes what's called the Senate later on. It's the Council of Elders, because senex in Latin means an elderly gentleman. He also discovers, though, that his city, interestingly, does not get along with any of the neighbors. I think that's what happens generally when you're the outside invading force. Somehow, you don't necessarily get along with the native people there. So Romulus, because he's got these families of senators, the patricians so-called, finds that it's necessary to keep the patricians married amongst each other and not allowing anybody else, any of the plebeians, who are the essentially underlings of society, to marry into the patrician families. Now, if you have studied anything about European monarchical history, and maybe other parts of the world too, you will find that there is a common theme about the need to keep families within families. I suspect you can imagine that that leads to a great deal of inbreeding. And it's not by coincidence that many European monarchical families were beset with numerous ills such as insanity, various acts of barbarism carried out, and such. Now, the problem that Romulus observes immediately is that he has too small a breeding pool of patrician senatorial families. It's interesting because the reason why they're called patrician is that the word in Latin for father, pater, is also attached to senator, meaning that the senators are like fathers of their country. So it's interesting to see that they're also supposed to be the sires of the next generation of rulers, and unfortunately that does not anatomically, medically work very well, because if you have too few families, you're not going to be able to have a real acceptable pool of possible descendants to come from, a viable descendancy. So Romulus sends out word to all the various tribes outside. Please come and marry us so that we can expand. What's the answer? A great surprise. No, of course not. So Romulus tries a different tack. We're going to have a huge celebration of Neptune. Everybody come, bring your women and children, and we will have a grand ball. Okay, everybody comes. All the women of a group called the Sabines are all assembled in a particular area, the center of town. No one happens to notice that there's a spearman here, a spearman here, a spearman here, a spearman over here, a spearman back here. No one notices that. Okay, so the celebration gets underway. The sacrifice is about to occur. Suddenly there's a signal. Wham! The men grab the women. This is referred to as the rape of the Sabines. The Sabine populace is furious, and their king Titus Tatius organizes an invasion. There were alternative traditions that suggest that Titus Tatius may actually have successfully taken over Rome for a time. In the end, after fighting between the Romans and the Sabines, the women themselves, according to Livy, actually interrupt a battle that's about to occur and say, stop this fighting. If you all die, we will simultaneously be widowed and orphaned. It's a very effective way of ending the war. Not likely true. But in any event, that leads to an alliance between the Romans and the Sabines. Apparently the Romans are wonderful rapists and really, really good husbands. It's important to know that. Okay, so this is the way of keeping the Roman civilization going. As it turns out, it's very effective, and Romulus gets it going. So eventually, one day, he is out in his, with his army out on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, training, and all of a sudden, along comes a big whirlwind of dust, and he's gone. Well, actually, what really happened, according to Livy, is that senators who didn't like how popular he was with the people, all the plebeians, you know, all the inferiors of society, actually assassinated him. And when they did so, well, they made up the story that he disappeared in a cloud of dust, because that was a really good way a believable way of covering up their murder. That's what really happened, according to Livy. Well, we're not sure, obviously. But in any event, Romulus undergoes an effectively mythic ending of his quite successful first king rule. There are 6 more kings afterwards who are associated with religion, that's Numa, and also the 6th king of Rome who is associated with the census, all of the various property classes, who gets to vote. Quite interesting when you examine the census classes in detail, that the wealthiest minority up at the top end up being able to get all the votes. Interesting. Anyway, the census classes. So we have Romulus, Numa, we have Tullus Hostilius, who is much more warlike, Ancus Marcius, who also engages in war, especially with the Etruscans, who are right north of the Romans. They actually capture a city called Fidenae up there in order to start making inroads into Etruscan territory. Then we have the first of 3 Etruscan kings, interestingly. We have Tarquin Priscus, not too bad a guy, still rather warlike. Servius Tullius is the one who initiates the census. And then finally, the really bad dude, Tarquinius Superbus. His name means superb, excellent. It basically means you think you're superb. So actually it means that you're arrogant. You can add an appropriate epithet if you wish. So Tarquin Superbus is pretty mean. He really is tyrannical, the way he runs things. And his son Sextus Tarquinius has a really insatiable libido. And ends up being invited as an ambassador to the home of a very chaste lady named Lucretia, who is the wife of one of the leading Roman generals named Collatinus. The rather libido-driven Sextus spends the night at their house. And during the night, he gets out of bed, he forces his way under the cover of darkness into Lucretia's bedroom, and with a knife, holds her at knife point and forces her to submit. She is so devastated by the violation of her chastity that she then commits suicide in front of her father and husband. Because in fact, Lucretia had been known as the most chaste wife anywhere. There even had been a bet right before the murder, right before the rape and suicide, that no wife anywhere was more chaste than Collatinus' wife. And to prove the point, Collatinus brought several men, including Sextus, home with him to meet Lucretia, and it turned out that Lucretia was very chastely working on her domestic affairs, including weaving, and that's when Sextus fell in love with her. And it goes from there. By the way, the same pattern about infiltrating somebody's house in order to take advantage of the woman, you may remember is the same pattern with Paris, infiltrating Menelaus and Helen's house as an ambassador in order to spend the night and then in fact get hold of Helen in order to initiate the Trojan War. All right, so as a result of this, the kingship is overthrown. Collatinus and another member of the family named Brutus, who is indeed the ancestor of the famous Brutus who assassinated Caesar, the two of them team up in order to get rid of Tarquin Superbus, and the kingship ends and the republic begins. The republic consists of 2 consuls and several other subordinate offices under it, and now it's run effectively by the consuls and the Senate together, and it now runs on the rule of law. For a long time, the republic is mainly patrician-based, while the plebeians, who are not at all connected with the senatorial families and fear that they will not receive fair representation, don't appreciate this. They actually rebel very early on in the republic, and they form their own government that includes tribunes, 3 officers of the plebeian assembly, who oversee plebeian affairs and are able to get hold of a special privilege. In Latin, it's called intercessio. It is a special veto that has no override power. The veto, not subject to senatorial override, basically blocks a senatorial measure if it's considered to be at the disadvantage of the plebeians. The senators for a long time laugh at this, but after a time when it's clear that the plebeians well outnumber the patricians, the senators have to go along with that. And in fact, in two very important years later in the Republic, 367 BC and 342 BC, additional legislation is passed by the Senate to not only permit, but actually require consuls to be of plebeian birth. So the plebeians do, in time, make strides. All right, well, the Republic is built up slowly around Rome itself, initially, gradually making inroads in Italy by making alliances. The rule of law initially is carried out by what is called the 12 Tables, which is the first formal written law code in Rome. Very simplistic and very basic. It actually technically stayed in control for the entirety of Roman history, even though there were many other laws that were passed afterwards that ended up often superseding or modifying many of the precepts of the 12 Tables. So the Romans gradually expanded militarily, first all through Italy. They made alliances, and where necessary they carried out conquests. They eventually, up in the 300s BC, completed the conquest of the northern part of Italy, and they set the border with Gaul. That was especially important because the Gauls actually invaded and took over Rome for a time, and it took several years, in fact even a couple of decades, for the Romans to get rid of them. The Romans, in the meantime, also had invaded the Etruria, the Etruscan territory, and they destroyed in 396 BC the very important city of Veii. Kind of unfortunately, because Veii was a very well-established society with wonderful artwork and such, and it was kind of unfortunate to see it destroyed, but that's what happened. And so the Romans gradually moved north, eventually secured the north after they got over the invasion of the Gauls, and then eventually turned around and went back south. And finally, in 272 BC, the Romans completed the entire conquest of Italy by taking over Tarentum. And that, in 272 BC, secured Italy as a province. In the next several decades, the Romans expanded outward. They were lured out to Sicily by a dispute between themselves and the city of Carthage over in North Africa on Sicily, the territories between the Romans and also Greeks, as it happens, and the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians had actually had a very bad history on Sicily before of disputes, because back in 480 BC, there was a major dispute between Carthaginians and Greeks at a town called Himera, a draw. So in that conquest, we see that the Carthaginians were trying to make inroads into what was thought to be principally Greek territory. So now we have another dispute that comes up over a place called Messene in the northeast part of Sicily. This leads to the first of 3 Punic Wars. Punic refers to Phoenician, which is where the Carthaginians originally came from, because it was the Phoenicians many years ago, seafaring, who founded the city of Carthage in North Africa. So this war eventually leads to a defeat of the Carthaginians by the Romans, and the Romans take Sicily as a province. Thereafter, the very famous Hannibal, who was the son of the original general in that war, Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal invaded Spain, which the Romans were trying to take as a territory, and hit at a Roman ally out there, Saguntum. As a result, the really famous Punic War from 219 to 201 BC occurred, in which Hannibal took his elephants all the way across the Alps, so like this direction, and invaded Italy, and even defeated the Romans several times in battle, quite disastrously, especially in 216 BC at a place called Cannae, where Hannibal was able to destroy an entire Roman legion in a box canyon type of arrangement with an ambush. The Romans never forgot that. So the Romans were frightened of Hannibal. He did almost take over Rome. However, the Romans, against their normal policy, sent out a guy named Fabius to chase Hannibal all around Italy. He had the nickname Cunctator, which means the delayer, because he refused ever to engage in combat. He was just delaying and stalling for time. So he chased Hannibal around for a long enough time, finally forced Scipio, eventually Scipio Africanus, to invade Carthage and force Hannibal to withdraw and return to Carthage. In 202 BC, the Romans defeated the Carthaginians at Zama, not far from Carthage, and they made peace with the Carthaginians in 201 BC. Thereafter, the Carthaginians were told, keep your paws off Roman territory. They didn't listen. The Carthaginians invaded Roman territory in 149 BC, and the Romans were fast with retribution. A 3-year-long Third Punic War concluded with the complete destruction of Carthage. The city was razed to the ground, and the soil was sowed with salt so as to prevent any crops from growing in that area in the future. Actually, the city of Carthage was rebuilt later, but it never again posed any serious threat to the Romans, although other North Africans very definitely did. Now, in the course of all that, the Romans learned that the Macedonians, ruled by a later Philip, actually allied with Hannibal. Oops, there's a rule in the ancient world: never ally with a loser. Bad idea. The winner will come get you. So the Romans turned their attention, when the Punic War was finished, to Macedonia, and they made very quick work of the Macedonians. And when the Greeks further south also allied with the Macedonians, the Romans came through and made very quick work of the Greeks also. So 192 BC, 168 BC, and finally, most critically, 146 BC, the same year as the destruction of Carthage, the Romans took over Macedonia and Greece in a very quick, rapid 30-year-long campaign. It did go in multiple stages, but different Macedonian wars. But eventually it all fell under Roman control. 146 BC, that's what ended Greek history effectively. And it just kept on going from there. The Romans went further east. They expanded their occupation of Spain. And then the really critical point of history for the end of the Republic is when Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar, made his way up northwest of Italy into Gaul, it's now France, and managed to conquer Gaul, as well as the Helvetian territory, which is now Switzerland, and the whole area along the Pyrenees bordering Spain, and went further up into Britain even. He was not able to actually conquer Britain, but he did set the stage for the Romans eventually to make their way into Britain. It was finally, in the imperial days, Emperor Claudius in the AD 55 period, who finally was able to completely conquer Britain and make it into a Roman province in the imperial days. So the Republic continued that way for several centuries, really relatively successfully. But there was a problem underpinning the whole Republican structure, having to do with the problem, again, about the plebeians and the patricians. Because one difficulty was that as the Romans were expanding outward this way militarily, they were getting hold of a lot of land. And the land was publicly owned, and then it was being given away to wealthy citizens or veterans. That would be fine, except that there was a law on the books that limited how much land somebody could get that way. And that rule was being violated. So in the late Republic, a couple of tribunes of the plebs spoke up and said, wait a minute, are we not violating this law? I think we better reenact it, and we better go to all the people who have too much land and take it away from them. As you can well imagine, that request met with assassination. Because it turns out both of the tribunes, when they got so much resistance, ended up actually fomenting rebellion, and the rebellion ended up, of course, leading to their assassination. Well, that was the tipping point for the Republic, because when that happened, a whole series of military conflicts came up in the last century of the Republic, involving private citizens who now have armies of their own. The one who started this process off was Marius, who was responsible for a successful conquest of a king named Jugurtha down in North Africa. But in order for him to do that, he actually had to raise a private army of his own, which was previously illegal. He also held an unprecedented 7 consulships in a row. And so Marius became supremely powerful at that point, but Marius was a plebeian, which meant that he did not connect well with the patricians. Now, later in the Republic, we have a senator named Sulla, who was supposed to be appointed a generalship over an enemy named Mithridates over near the Black Sea. So the Senate appointed him general. All of a sudden, the tribune of the plebs vetoed that appointment and then went to the plebeian assembly and said, put Marius in his place, which they did. As a result, civil wars suddenly broke out between Sulla supporters and Marius supporters, and Rome was torn to pieces politically and never recovered during the time of the Republic. So that period concluded in 79 BC. Marius died of natural causes. Sulla took over Rome for 3 years, instituted a reign of terror against Marius' supporters, and then died himself in 79 BC, leaving a big power vacuum. The Senate was in no position, because of their incursion now against tribunes, to be able to restore order. So it fell to wealthy and powerful private citizens, such as Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, Crassus, the wealthiest Roman on record as far as we know, to raise private armies of their own and work with the Senate to try to restore order. They were actually consuls in 70 BC, and they were very popular, especially with the plebeians, because when Sulla was in power, he took away all of the tribunician powers. He repealed them. Pompey and Caesar, were consuls in 70 BC, and they gave the tribunician powers back. So the people really liked them. They were very generous. So after another century of further problems, the three of them, Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, formed an informal arrangement called a triumvirate, in which basically they split up the Roman world 3 ways. So Crassus went east, Caesar went north, and Pompey was everywhere else. And for a while that was okay, for a few years, but it broke down eventually because Crassus, unfortunately, was defeated in combat out in Parthia in 53 BC and died. And of course all that money got lost. And also the Roman standards of the army were lost too. And Pompey and Caesar had some problems between each other. They didn't see everything eye to eye, it turned out. And they were kind of vying for the attention of the Senate eventually. Pompey was married to Caesar's daughter Julia, but Julia died in 54 BC, so that liaison was lost. So, well, the real conflict that came up was that while Caesar was up north conquering Gaul, Pompey and the Senate together became very nervous that Caesar might eventually turn around and try to take over Rome. And so, when Caesar finally asked in 49 BC to return to Rome with his army to stand for consul, Pompey and the Senate refused to allow him. They said, "You will not be allowed to come back to Rome unless you disband your army." That was a standing rule of Roman command called imperium, that you were not allowed to hold imperium both in Rome and out in a province, and especially with an army. If you were going to traverse from one area to the other, you had to give up the imperium and give up any army you had that the imperium allowed you to command. So Caesar was told he would have to give up his army. He refused. He crossed this little river called the Rubicon, a tributary of the Po, that, as it happened, separated Gallic territory from Italian territory, and thereby declared civil war against Pompey. Pompey, it turned out, was not up to the task. The next year, Caesar chased Pompey to Greece and defeated him in Pharsalus, which is in Thessaly in Greece. Pompey eventually fled down to Egypt, and there was assassinated. He probably had some liaison with Cleopatra, the queen down there. Many prominent Romans did. So it's not surprising that Pompey went there, and Caesar went there afterwards, and I'm sure Caesar had a thing with Cleopatra as well. But anyway, Caesar became sole commander of Rome then effectively in 48 BC, and he said, now I'm going to go around and do lots and lots of stuff all around everywhere with nobody else running Rome. Now Caesar had a position called dictator, which was basically like an emergency position that was only supposed to be in place for 6 months or 1 year in order to see to it that the Republican state of Rome would not come to any harm. The problem was somehow that position became perpetual for Caesar. It was ongoing. By the way, that was also true of Sulla during his reign of command. So Caesar had this position, and when he became very cavalier with the Senate, refusing senatorial appeals, looking like he might want to become king, even though he insisted he didn't, and having all these big plans about places he wanted to go, eventually the senators ganged up on him, 44 BC, and assassinated him in the Senate, the Ides of March, March 15th. And so, the Republic continued. We have another triumvirate now, this time of 3 major leaders. We have Octavian, that's Caesar's adopted son. We have Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, and another wealthy man named Lepidus. They formed a formal triumvirate the year after Caesar's assassination in 43 BC, and that was intended primarily to go after the assassins, and then also once again to divide up the empire in order to bring it to peace. So the three of them worked well together initially. 42 BC, the two assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were again chased to Greece, to Thessaly, and at Philippi in 42 BC, they were hunted down and both committed suicide. However, once again, the triumvirate failed because, once again, there was a marriage. This time it was Octavian's sister Octavia, who was married to Antony. Antony was assigned to the east. He went over to the east, and once again, Cleopatra enters the scene. And Antony, it turned out, was much more beloved with Cleopatra than he was with his own wife, who was apparently quite homely in appearance. And so as a result, Antony basically deserted his wife Octavia, even refusing to give her a divorce, and took up with Cleopatra. For a time, the two of them were still reasonably united because the two of them took on Lepidus and basically squeezed him out. Lepidus didn't appreciate that and actually attacked one of their armies in Sicily in 36 BC. He teamed up with Sextus Pompeius, a son of Pompey the Great, who was also trying to get into the scheme as well. And the two of them ended up actually being beaten at Naupactus, 36 BC, and Lepidus was out of the picture. But now that left Octavian and Antony at loggerheads. And eventually Octavian got Antony declared a public enemy of Rome. Once again, the Senate passed its special resolution called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, giving Octavian special dictatorial powers because Antony was an enemy and we needed to see to it that the Roman Republic came to no harm. Octavian went out eventually and chased after Antony, and the big occurrence, 31 BC, was the Battle of Actium in northwest Greece. There, Mark Antony was defeated. He again fled to Egypt. 30 BC, he arrived there finally, but he committed suicide. And Cleopatra thereafter, famously with a snake, probably a cobra, not an asp, but with a snake, Cleopatra also committed suicide. Egyptian independent history now came to an end. Egypt now fell under Roman control as a new province. And also, the Republic effectively came to an end because now Octavian, it turned out, was a very skilled ruler who, unlike his predecessors, did know how to manage single-man rule successfully and was able to stave off any negative forces that might have brought him down. We'll talk more about that in the future videos. For now, again, as always, make sure that you sign in at the forum. And tomorrow, get ready to look over Virgil's Aeneid. We're going to talk about his work and Virgil himself, the author, and a little bit more about Roman literary history. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow for the 2 videos on Virgil and the continuation of Roman mythical history.